We're joined by Dr. Udi Sommer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Tel Aviv University. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here, David.
First of all, I know people in the U.S. in places like Connecticut, for example, who in the past years never owned a gun, never touched a gun in their lives, are now buying guns. There seems to be a rise in gun ownership across the U.S. What explains that?
Well, if you look at the public opinion polls, you see that Americans feel that a gun would would make them safer, which was not the case, 10 or 15 years ago. Public opinion polls show that for the first time, the majority of Americans, more than 50% of Americans, believe that gun rights should be protected under the Second Amendment, as was mentioned at the top of the item. So it's pretty clear that the support for gun rights is on the rise. On the other hand, if you look at the disparity between the parties, the disparity is very clear, okay?
Between the Republican and Democratic parties.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at the Republican parties, Republicans, although it was not the case 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, today the vast majority of Republicans, the overwhelming majority, are in support of gun rights, while for the Democrats you see a very stable pattern where for decades now the Democrats are not in favor, the vast majority of the Democrats are not in favor, are actually in favor of gun regulation and diminishing the ability of people to bear arms.
Again, to bring it back somewhat a personal anecdote of mine, I come from Phoenix, Arizona, and this is a place where I know I've spoken to a lot of people in previous years as the laws have gotten more lax, who, yes, they say they feel safer owning a gun. So therefore, it seems like everyone is owning a gun at this point. Is that the driver? Do you believe that adds safety? Is there any statistic that supports the fact that adds safety versus just throwing more guns into the pile and more into the shootout?
So research results are very complicated in that sense. It really depends on how you run that, etc. But it's not research that drives that, right? What drives that is public opinion, as we mentioned, but it's a variety of other things in the United States. You have a very strong lobby. The National Rifle Association is one important element of that, okay, which means that a lot of money is going into that. Now, that lobby influences another level of government, which is local government, okay? If you look at local state government, I mean, right? If you look at state government, the ability of the gun lobby, okay, of the NRA, for instance, to influence legislators at the state level is immense, okay, with the amount of money that they hold. And beyond that, there is a constitutional foundation for the whole thing, okay? There are two landmark cases, D.C. v. Heller in 2008 and then McDonald v. Chicago in 2010, where the Supreme Court entrenched the rights of individuals, both vis-a-vis the federal government and vis-a-vis state governments, to bear arms.
Well, I know that some states have strict laws, gun control laws here. Where are the guns in the U.S.? Is there a way to generalize, who owns most of the firearms?
Well, if you look at the geographic distribution, for instance, okay, so you mentioned your acquaintances from Connecticut.
For example,
well, for example, so the Northeast, okay, is the area where you have the least gun ownership, okay, the lowest level of gun ownership, around 27% or so in the Northeast. But if you look at other parts of the country, if you look at the Midwest, if you look at the Western country, and if you look at the South, you look at a little under 50% of households with gun ownership.
It's astounding to think about that basically every other house, you're saying, has a firearm inside.
Yeah, if you have a country with 330 million people and about 300 million firearms, okay, so you can, if you do the math, you realize that there are several households that have much more than a single firearm in the house.
So you mentioned the NRA here, the National Rifle Association, as a strong lobby. How strong are they still today in the current political map?
Well, they are strong. First of all, they are strong because they go in line with other trends, as we mentioned, trends in public opinion, etc. But beyond that, it's important to remember the different levels at which they can exercise their political clout. Okay, so we mentioned the state level. Okay, but if you look even at the federal level, okay, especially when it comes to congressional elections, okay, elections in the House, and even elections to the Senate, you see how the NRA is able to. When you talk the amount of money, the volume of money that you talk about in those elections is much smaller than, is bigger than at the state level, but it's much smaller than the numbers that we hear with respect to presidential elections, okay? And therefore, if the NRA is unable to be an actual threat to Hillary Clinton, for instance, who expressed her views very eloquently in the last 24 hours.
Smaller races and everything else.
Exactly, so they can heavily affect much smaller races.
Well, Dr. Udi Sommer, thank you very much for being with us here as we debate gun control in the United States.
My pleasure.
That's all. We'll be back after a short